So I'm Karen Cornwell. I've had, probably 30 plus years of product management experience, all in high tech, all in Silicon Valley, and with a bunch of different companies, which allows you to see things very differently. And what I'm going to do today is talk about how you can get more product innovation, also while you maximize profitability, right? Because it's something we all need, and it's really not that difficult to get, but you have to think about it differently. So I wanted to start, has everybody watched a product like fizzle and die? You do the big release and everybody's all hyper and then it just goes thump, 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 thump. Why does that happen? This is the part where you answer.
Market condition change.
Market conditions change.
Not what the customers wanted.
It's not what the customers wanted.
Lack of user adoption.
Lack
of user adoption.
But why wouldn't the users adopt it?
It wasn't intuitive. The UI may have been
It's hard to use.
hard to use.
Any others? A lot of these all get to what does your client need, right? And when you hit that sweet spot and you've got exactly what your client needs, it sells like hot potatoes, right? And if it doesn't, it does that thump, 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 thump thing that we all really dread and hope it's not our product. What I want to do today, and this is kind of an interesting way to approach it, is I'm going to talk about how do you understand customer needs. And I'm going to talk about it using a model that's actually a sales strategy model, which I learned years ago, and now I teach people how to do this. And it's a strategy model that's used for really complex sales, high dollar value sales, sales where you have multiple customer entities that all have a different opinion of what it is that they need, right? Which I think is kind of inherently what happens. And this model allows you to kind of coalesce all these together in order to understand client needs. Now, I teach this model over like a long period of time, so I'm not going to be able to teach you this model, okay? So this is a little frustrating. What I'm going to do is hop around in pieces of this model and look at, with a little bit of a laser focus, what is it that you can do to understand client needs better, right? And to really coalesce those into something. So this is the overall model. The model was developed years ago. A bunch of guys went out and got money to go study how do customers make large dollar value, complex buying decisions. And they went out and they studied a whole load of multinational companies. They looked at international companies. And they built this model that's generic. It doesn't matter what product or service you're selling, which is what was kind of unique, right? Is that they went out and said, how do the client make a decision? So I'm going to dive into various parts of this model because, like I said, I can't go through it all, so I apologize for that in advance. And focus in on a couple areas that are really important for us to understand in terms of getting to customer needs. Because a lot of times these products that go thump, 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 we didn't match the needs. We might have matched them somewhere. In fact, you usually match them somewhere with some group, but other groups might have been left out of the process, and then it doesn't really work too well. So one of the first steps of this model is to formulate a customer decision statement. What is the customer trying to do? And we usually formulate that starting with the words, how to. So maybe you guys can give me some examples of what your clients are trying to do and what decision statements they're trying to make. I'll give you a hint. It's not how to buy my product, right? Because most people start there. Well, that how to buy this thing that I'm selling, right? That's what everybody wants to say. But that's not what customers think, right? So how to, solve problem X with constraints Y by this amount of time. And when you start with your mental thinking in how to and what the client's thinking, it changes your entire perception because they don't care about your product. They want you to understand what their needs are, and they want you to then feed their product, match it to their needs, and show them how those two match together, and that's when they buy, right? So whenever you start thinking about it, you got to think about, from the client's perspective, how to do whatever they want to do, which is not necessarily buy your product. They're usually trying to solve a slightly different problem, and that's where the disconnect typically comes in. One of the things that happens when a client says, I need to do something different, is something changed in their environment. It can be market conditions, it can be the environment. It can even be something as crazy as the CEO says, you must reduce cost in this area. So it can be imposed on the client by senior management, by someone else, you know. I mean, the government is now saying, we really need to push to electric cars, right? So it can be an outside influence or even an internal company influence that gets people to something changed. And it's really important, if you can understand what's changed, it gives you a real good idea of what the needs are of that client, right? And you can get them to talk about what changed and made you want this kind of a thing. What changed and made you want this kind of a solution? And they'll talk about that, because when you ask, many people come in. I worked for one company, and the guys went out and they actually had binders, big binders of product information. They'd go into a customer meeting with these huge binders, these big 4-inch binders, and I'm like, what are you going to do with that? Beat the customer to death? And literally that was what they were doing, right? Well, if we show them enough technical information, they'll buy, and that's never true. It never works that way. I guess it feels good carrying around those binders, but it really doesn't work. So to crawl into the customer's head and find out what changed, because it could have been imposed, it could have been that something's not working, it could have been the competitors now are doing a better job than they were before, you know, so they have to catch up, right? But try to understand what changed. And when you look at the cycle of something that changes, clients go through these 6 stages of the buying process. In the first stage, they look at needs. What are our needs? You know, what went wrong? How are we going to do this? Then they start analyzing, what do we need to fix it? They look at options. What are the things in the marketplace out there where we could do something different? Then they start to actually structure what it is they need. That structure piece, that's where an RFQ comes out. Right, so if you're not engaged in those first 3 boxes and you're responding to an RFQ, you're like 3 steps behind from the starting point, right? And then they make the buy decision, and then there's another step which people frequently forget, which is they have to implement your product. And of course, a lot of clients can get very dissatisfied with you when they try to implement the product and it doesn't work, or it doesn't fit with their legacy systems, or it just doesn't connect, and they have a lot of trouble implementing it. Another piece of this is who's involved in the buying process, because different buyers have different needs. So an owner is really the ultimate authority, right? They're the ones who actually they control the decision process. They may not make the decision, but they control the process. And they're really focused on long-term value. Never talk to an owner about price, right? Because that drives them to a place that you don't want them to go. Then there are experts, right, in the community. And they're the people that set the standards, that set the requirements. And they're a very important lot. And what they're usually concerned about is doing things correctly, doing things right. The next one is users. Now, users are typically the people you start the conversation with, right? And they implement things. They don't usually change a lot, but they'll determine whether your product is good. And their concerns are how easy it is for me to use. How much pain will I have to go through to implement your product? Because they're the ones who have to do it, right? How cheap is it, and what kind of schedule can you get, right? These people are really down to earth, getting things. All these different groups have a different set of needs, and you need to speak to the different groups in a different language. One of the things you do in this process is you do your stakeholder analysis, and you look at all these different characteristics of these people from the client side, and you figure out where they are, how positive they are with your company, with your product, and a bunch of things. And when you finish that, you go in and you line up your people against their people. So you would never, ever, ever have one of your users talk to one of their owners, because they speak a different language, right? You would not send an engineer in to talk to a CFO, right? Because they don't talk the same language, right? So you really have to separate those two out and make sure you're conversing in the same language. But you need to have all of these conversations at the same time, which is where it gets complicated from a sales process and from a needs analysis process. The second piece, and I'm jumping now to a new phase, are how do customers decide to buy? What kicks them over the line that goes from I'm not going to buy to I'm going to buy, right? And that is barriers to purchase. And we look at it as a barrier as opposed to what pushes me over, what keeps me from stepping over the line to say I'm not going to buy to I'm going to buy. And there are 5 categories of barriers. One is the need. And that happens to be what is the need for the product, but it also happens to be what is the need for your company, okay? So it used to be in the 70s and 80s, nobody could go wrong buying from IBM, right? No one could question that decision, but if you bought from, this podunk little company and the product totally failed when you tried to implement it internally, you're out the door, right? Your job is gone, but nobody got fired for buying from IBM. So that's where your company reputation, of course, comes in. Yes?
But how does it relate to the need?
Say it again.
If I choose the selected vendor, is not related to the need, right? It's, if I buy
It's the need for your company, right? And that comes into support, right? Do we think they're going to be able to support us? Are they big enough to handle all our worldwide locations? And do you have business practices that are compatible with our business practices? Right, because there are companies that can't do business with each other because they can't agree on terms and conditions. They can't, one company wants some outlandish thing and you're not willing to give into that, right? So, it's not just your product, but it's your whole process that has to be compatible. And you can be not compatible based on the need for your company. Do I need this company?
There's just a risk, I think, about the decision maker to take a risk or a decision about the product. Obviously, if he chooses IBM, he feels less of a risk.
Right. I can't get fired if I choose IBM, right? I mean, or I couldn't back then. I guess now you probably could, right? But back then you couldn't.
Now you get fired if you choose IBM.
Oh, yeah, now I think you can get fired for anything. So it's like, I don't know, it's become commodities.
Well, Accenture or one of those big companies might be the equivalent in today's, right?
Yes, they'd be the equivalent today. And they might not have as much clout, for example, if they haven't been functioning in that particular industry, right? Let's say they're trying to push into a new industry segment, but they haven't been there before. And it's like, well, why would I want to do business with you when you don't understand my industry, right? So that can separate you out. Compatibility. How well does the product actually meet my needs? And that's back to what are the needs. You got to understand what the needs are. And then the company also. How do you do business? How do we structure? Can we work together? Right? Oops, my finger's too happy. Relationships. What is the company's image? Your company's image with this company. Have they never heard of you before? Right? Do you have a reputation? Do you do business with their competitors? Do you do business in the same industry? Is it something they can see that you're going to be compatible with them? And then economics. So you have to understand the client's budgeting process, particularly for high dollar value things. These are things that you might go in and you say, okay, first we're going to look at a feasibility study, right? We're going to do a little study and see if it works. And when we finish that, then we move on and we pick an area, a target area where we're going to do implementation. And then we go in and we do, a bigger implementation. We expand out, we're going to do it in this division in California first before we tackle the entire multinational company in the world, right? And it builds from that. But you have to understand, what is it, when do they do their budgeting? How much money needs to go in whose budget, right? Who would control, because the person who might control the money for a feasibility study is not the person who's going to control the worldwide rollout, right? I mean, those are very different people. So you have to understand who controls what and how they do budgeting and what's the cycle. Because many companies are still doing, unfortunately, annual budgeting. And so if you don't get the money in next year's budget for your feasibility study, you can try to sell all you want, but they're not gonna be able to buy it, right? Unless you have an owner, you know, who has the money in his back pocket and you can convince him, and then they may buy it. And then competition, right? People have a lot of options, and of course, the biggest option for most people is do nothing. Right? I'm just gonna live with this, whatever it is, and I'm not gonna change anything. Right? They can hire somebody else. A lot of companies will fix it ourselves. I think we're starting in tech anyway to get out of that mode. But engineers are all, oh, we can fix this. We'll fix it ourselves. And it's like, you're gonna develop a solution that, you know, this is not our business, but engineers like to do that, right? I think we're getting out of that mode. Jeff's back there laughing. But it's true, right? We can fix it ourselves. So there are a lot of barriers.
I agree with you that we're getting away from that.
Do you think so? I mean, I hope that we're getting away from it, because I've watched some pretty crazy things happen. So these are the barriers to purchase, and one of the first things you have to do is you look at where is your client now, and how far do you need to push them to get them to say buy? And you do this with each one of these categories. And it's, you know, there's a detailed process for laying this out, but I want to make sure I get through all this stuff, right? So you look at the gap analysis, and then you look at it. What you might find in some of these cases is I don't have to push people too far to push them over the buy line, right? And in other cases, you may see that you have huge gaps. You know, and if the huge gap is in relationships, then you don't need your technical people talking to their technical people necessarily, right? You may need their experts talking to your experts, or you may need to have an owner level conversation. So you may really need to have the you know, the VP of the product go in and talk to one of their VPs. But you really have to isolate and look at where is the biggest change needed to get them to move from where they are to being willing to buy from you. So, there we go. So what you do when you start this process is you generate a list of client issues. And notice I didn't say generate a list of issues that you think the client has. It's generate a list of client issues. So you go and you talk to them and you say, you know, what are the issues that you're trying to solve? And some of them may be issues that you can't do anything about. They may be outside of your sphere, but if they're part of the customer's problem and you can bring them a complete solution, or they got the whole product solution, then you're going to be in a lot better shape. And you may need to partner with people to do this. I was working in the power industry, and we wanted to upgrade nuclear power plants. That was part of my early career, right? And they said, and a lot of our clients said, oh no, we can't do this. We don't have the money to do upgrades to the turbine, because turbines are kind of really expensive, right? And upgrades of turbines are really expensive. And so I said, great, I'm working for GE. I have GE Capital, right? So I ended up pushing a proposal all the way up to Jack Welch, believe it or not, he had to approve it, that said, we'll get GE Capital to buy their turbine back, we'll upgrade it, and then we'll lease it to them, right? It eliminated the money problem, right? So we were able to bring a bigger solution in by understanding that we don't have the money, we don't have that pot of money, and we don't think we could justify it with our management. And then all of a sudden, of course, when they looked at it and said, GE Capital is willing to finance this, and of course everybody knows GE Capital is a bunch of sharks, right? Then they went, well, shoot, maybe we can find the money internally. But we pushed through that barrier by being able to make that offer, right? But just trying to do this without solving their money problem made it a non-fix for them. You look at the barriers and you say, how far do we have to push them? So we actually have a scale, and you say, where are they now and where do they need to go? Well, people don't have to go to 100% to buy. I mean, who's bought a car and has had a few little doubts in the back of your mind about whether it was the right one, right? There's always a couple of these, well, will it work? right? Is it, I like everything about it except for this, right? And so those are the things you say, how far do they have to go in order to make a buy decision? And it's, like I said, it's never 100%. You can usually do it at less than that. Yes?
Can you give a couple examples of the criteria you would establish? Like even in the example you gave of them not having capital to do the turbine upgrade?
Well, let's say you're looking at relationships, right?
Mhm.
And you say, well, our CEO and their CEO don't know each other at all, right? A relationship to buy might not be that they have to get married, okay? A relationship to buy might be that they have to get far enough for them to have a trust relationship, right? And then you look at what does it take to get to that stage, right? I mean, they don't have to be best friends and play squash together and, drink beer on Saturday.
Right, so how do you articulate that as a criteria?
For each one, you kind of have to, for each of these categories, you have to kind of pick the criteria yourself. And usually this is a team sell because you have a lot of people working at a lot of different levels, collecting information from the client and then bringing it back. And so you let your team pick what the criteria is. And the only thing they have to do is agree, right? Because this is never an exact science, right? It's really about pushing the customer forward.
But should would criteria be more like trust is the criteria, or the criteria is our CEO and their CEO gets together at least 3 times?
And that might be the criteria, is that they've met, they've gotten together, but what you're doing when you do that is trying to get trust, right? So if they meet and have a fight, you didn't get the trust, but if they meet and they, if the CEO, what's important to him is, I want to know that when I call you, if something's wrong after we start this project, that you're going to go kick your team into gear and fix it, right? And that's the, you have my word that I will be behind this product and watching this because maybe it's the first implementation in this particular industry, right? And so the CEO's going, I got a lot of risk here. They've never done it before, they've not. So I want assurances from your CEO that he's going to pull out the stops if things start to go south and fix it, right? And that, but that criteria might be different if it's something that's been sold many times in that industry, right? Then you might not need as much. So it is kind of a variable scale. The team really needs to look at it and say, how good is it, right? Is it working? But they're very different, and they can be very different. Even if you're selling, you end up with the same kind of a product for 2 different customers, it might be very different criteria. So determine where they need to be. And then what are the issues that require action, right? Our CEO has never met your CEO, therefore he doesn't trust your company. Have them meet, right? So you identify those criteria, right? Or you may, in some cases, our expert and your expert don't know each other, or they disagree on a couple of fundamental things. You may need to get them together to say, can we make this work somehow? So that's another one. And then, of course, you look at what are your actions to reduce the gap. But because there's 5 criteria, you may choose not to work on some at all, right? You may say they're close enough. They're far enough out there. So what I said before is usually when a client has a need that's generated, something has happened to generate that need. And now we're going to take that little wheel and we kind of unroll it. And what happens, where is it? So customers start at the far right, which is kind of weird, but that's how we did the process. They started at the far right, which is used. We were happily doing what we were doing until something broke. Somebody told me I had to do it different. The industry regulations changed, right? Something happened, and it drove me back to say, we need to do something different. So what do we need? And in the needs, there's a whole list here of, it's not working anymore. A lot of things can go to it's not working. Or the standards changed, right? The EPA says our cars have to, be much more fuel efficient. How are we going to get there? And at this stage, clients are really trying to define their problem. And this is an excellent stage to get into, because when you hear what their problem is, you can really help solve it. The next stage is they kind of analyze, what is the problem, what caused the problem, and they're really reaching out. Analyze, they tend to be a little bit backward looking. So they're kind of looking back into the past and saying, well, we were doing this and something changed and now we're going to have to do this. They actually pivot when they go from analyze to options. So they move from looking backwards to looking forwards and saying, so what are we going to do to fix this? And this is where they start forming solutions. They make up what they want to do. If you are in the room while they are making up what they want to do, you're going to be in a really great position to sell to them, and you're going to understand their needs. And when I'm talking needs here too, I'm not just talking the needs for the product. You have to play into the people needs too. This VP of marketing really wants to be seen as an outstanding marketer. And is there something about my product that can make him do that, right? And so you got to play into those needs also, right? Because that's, you make him look good and then you look good. And by the way, he'll continue to pull you into the company when you do that. So it's kind of bigger than just the technical scope. A lot of times clients look at a pilot or a test, let's try this out here and see if it works. So, but they make that up, and if you're there with them, you understand why they made it up that way, so you're in a great position to align your product with their needs. You're also, while you're doing this, going, wow, who would have thought that these people with nuclear power plants would need financing, right? So that's a whole new need that popped out, at least for me, in order to go sell products. So, and they set expectations, what is it that we want this thing to do when we're done? And what is not involved. And they make that up as they go along. And you need to be in there talking to them at all these different levels, right? At the owner level, at the expert level, and at the user level to figure it out. And then your team needs to come back and kind of assemble, this is how we push forward. In structuring, typically in structuring, that's where an RFQ comes out. Okay, so if you're the recipient of an RFQ that says, please deliver this to me, you've missed the first 3 steps. And you're gonna have to do some homework to catch up on those 3 steps, right? Because if you don't understand why they did some of these, then it's gonna be really hard for you to show how your product meets their needs if you don't know the needs. So in this structure, they say, what is it that we're that we need, right? And what are the performance standards? What's the budget? What's the schedule? How are we going to measure it? How do we know if it worked? Well, what defines success once we've implemented it? And terms and conditions, right? You're going to give me this thing and then disappear in a year? I want you on the hook for, X amount of time, right, for warranty and that kind of thing. Because believe it or not, those things can break deals, right? Then buy, everybody proceeds, everybody agrees. Of course, this never happens the first time around, right? It's kind of iterative. And then you go back to use, and use at the beginning when they've made a decision also includes all the implementation for that decision. So all the things that have to be done, and a lot of times companies can get all the way, and when they get to use, they break down because it wasn't easy for the client to implement. It didn't work right. They didn't understand some. They thought there were some features that weren't there when it got delivered, right? And there's a lot of potential dissatisfaction there. And you have to look there and make sure you've designed it and you've specified out what they need and not give them things that they don't need, right? Because that's just money you're not asking. All right. Great. Questions? I went through this really fast, so.
I was thinking of partnerships where trying to either co-create something together. It seems like there's similar in structure there as far as needs analyze, everything except maybe the buy, or maybe the buy is any thoughts on?
No, a partnership model is really attuned to to this overall model, go back up. The partnership model is really attuned to this overall model, because in this process, you may find out that the barriers to purchase, that's where you find out, you know, a client needs financing. Of course, you don't do financing, but you may need to go find a partner to do that. You know, they may need other things, and you can go find a partner to do that too. And even with a partnership, there's a decision to buy, right? Decision to partner, right? And you have to go through these kinds of steps to get.
It might be a parallel process, right, that we're looking at and analyzing partnership options in addition to buy options.
Oh, definitely. And you may want to, you may even end up wanting to partner with different partners for different clients because they have different needs, right? Because this partner solution fixes some clients' needs, but this partner solution fixes other clients' needs depending on, it might be industry dependent, but it might be just needs dependent. But it's a kind of a complex process. Any other questions?
In your experience, how have you managed like the stakeholder analysis or the differences in terms of the buying decision? Because they're always going to differ based upon the stakeholders' needs. They differ.
Oh, definitely.
So how do you manage those differences in the buying decision? How does it take priority, like what stakeholders, you know, needs might be different than another?
And that's one of the things where the selling process gets hard, because, you know, actually you end up satisfying one or the other or somewhere in between. And what I frequently found is you may have to get their stakeholders together to agree on what they need, because a lot of times, I mean, they start at total opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And you have to get them to see it, because otherwise this internal battle, by the way, you walk into many internal battles with this, right? May have been going on for 10 years.
Right.
And you have to be able to come in and say that. One of the things that's really, I didn't see my, let's see. This one must be grayed out or something. But in the overall process, you can look at it when you look at the overall grid of how decisions are made. What you find is you want people to literally walk through the grid. Let's see, this grid, but it's not showing for some reason. So this grid, what you do is you put your owner, experts, and evaluators on the left side, and then you lay out where are they in the process. And one of the key things to get is to get people to move through this process, to like together. And what happens sometimes is like you get a new guy who comes into the picture, nobody knew about him. Well, he's got a whole different set of needs, right, that nobody knew about. And you have to go back and you have to walk that person through the first steps and get them caught up to the next, to where the whole group is, right? And let me tell you, they will not move if they are not satisfied, right? I mean, if you've got three-quarters of the people all get it and they're happy, but one guy hasn't heard it, they will dig in their heels and they will force a decision not to be made. And that happens a lot because you've got one person sitting out there not willing to make a decision because their questions aren't answered. And a lot of times that's your expert, right? They can be really stubborn. I mean, they're really smart, but they can be really stubborn. And in that case, you need to have your experts sit down with their experts and find out what the issues are. And sometimes the experts are stuck on something that their own leadership doesn't care about, right? So you may have to go in and talk to their owner and say, you know, your guys are telling me that this is an absolute requirement. Is it really? Is it really? Because we could build this into the system, but if we do, it's gonna cost like twice as much. Is it really a requirement before we move forward? And then you have the owner go back down into his own experts and say, come on, guys, is this really a requirement? I mean, I know you'd like it, right? Or, you know, because engineers, we want everything, right? But is it an absolute requirement? Can we start without it? Can it be added later? Can it be, because what happens is if you've got one person doing that, you know, they're expanding the scope of the project maybe well beyond what the senior management team wants. Right, and they say, no, we all agreed we wanted a starter set and we would grow it from there. But you know, so sometimes when you find that out, you use their own people to do the convincing.
So it's really understanding the culture within that company and saying, all right, this is, how do we move them through that? Another customer has a very different flow because of the different culture.
Yes, very, very different. And I've also seen, interestingly enough, this process used to stop a decision. So back in my GE days, a client was about to buy nuclear fuel from another vendor. And it was like Friday night when we found out, right? Friday night. Everything happens over the weekend, right? It never happens during the week. Friday night, and they're going to announce it on Monday, right? You know, they're going to put out we have awarded this bid to our competitor, right? And so we found out that they had made that decision. So the decision was made. Well, we had one of our fuels guys who knew one of their fuels guys and had a good relationship with him, called him up over the weekend and said, Joe, are you aware that when you put in this other company's fuel, that you're gonna have to do this, and this before you can get it licensed? And that guy went, shit. We don't have time to do, we can't do that. This will not work. And he's a high-placed guy, right? So he called the guy who made the decision and said, are you aware that you just committed us to this? And I'm going to tell you it's probably going to cost you another $3 million, right? And this is a $5 million deal. On Monday, the decision came out to buy our fuel, right? So you can move people backwards in the process with well-placed information. And that typically is in the expert arena, right? You can change the requirements by talking to the owner and saying, your people are telling me that they must have this. But a lot of times, you know, they want this, but they don't necessarily must have this, right? Or it can be added later because it ends up driving the cost up really high, right? And it's like, this is beyond where, you know, where we wanted to go. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with this process in terms of understanding needs, understanding the importance of needs, and understanding whose needs. That one of the most fatal things in this process is to have a person who's involved in the decision that you don't know about. And they're sitting in the back room giving requirements to other people and you don't even know they exist, right? And then all of a sudden, you know, you get an RFQ, right, that has needs that you can't match. You know, your product won't meet these needs. And that can be really deadly, right? Because essentially somebody else has gotten in there before you and has convinced them that they meet these needs. And they may have done it because they know you can't deliver on it, right? So there's a lot of things that go on kind of behind the scenes that are way beyond the technical picture to do this. What this process is really good at too is integrating the overall team, your team, because you really have all these different, you have, you know, the executives, you have product managers, you have people who have to use the product, you have all these different people that you're engaging with, and you have to have your people talking to their people, and then you pull all that together and say, what does it look like? And it's I have to say, it's not a pretty process because But this process helps because it kind of lays out the steps and it gives you a place to put all the information. And then you decide, is this important, is this something we have to work on or not?
Can you say a little more on that? In essence, who at the company's responsibilities is to own this process, and then what is product manager's role within this process?
It really depends on the kind of company that you're in. This is a strategic process. So it depends on, this is not something you use to sell bubblegum machines,
No, I get that, but like a GE, like, to me, a lot of this seems like the sales team would own this process.
Well,
ISFPM would
it's
contribute
usually
to
a
it.
combination of the sales team and the product team. Because it's between those two where they are supposed to understand the client's needs and you understand what you can deliver and you put them together. I mean, I spent a good part of my career talking to clients and saying, what do you need? And in some cases, it's not my area of expertise, right? And so in that case, I gotta go back, I gotta get the guy who really understands what this guy's talking about, and you go talk to them and figure out what it is that they need. And then we add it into this overall big map that we're creating that says, what is it that we're trying to deliver to this client, right? And looking at staging, and, is it something we have to deliver right off? Is it something we add on later? Is it because you have to balance how all these factors come together. Other questions? Suggestions? Cool, I gave you an extra 15 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.